Are you ready for the shocking truth about survival in Arctic conditions? Settlers in the early Middle Ages did not freeze to death in their wooden buildings on the icy shores. They built sophisticated climatic fortresses capable of withstanding the most violent ocean storms. Their architecture was based on precise aerodynamic calculations and the impeccable preservation of every degree of heat. Early medieval settlements were not built haphazardly on empty, windswept ocean shores. The masters of the era carefully analyzed the movement of air masses before beginning any heavy work. They sought out deep fjords with high rocky shores to lay massive foundations. These stone walls broke powerful ice squalls into weak and safe currents. Watch the video to the end to learn the true cost, expressed in colossal labor and strict discipline, of simply building a warm shelter on the edge of an icy world. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about is the mathematical calculation involved in finding a place for a village. The construction of a village began with long observation of nature. Builders marked areas where the snow fell in an even layer. The absence of snowdrifts indicated a constant and strong draft. It was precisely these open spaces that were avoided when laying the foundations. Dwellings were hidden in the folds of the terrain, using every unevenness of the ground. River valleys offered natural protection from the winter cold. Dense forests on the slopes of the hills slowed down the speed of air currents. The trees served as the first line of defense against the icy breath of the ocean. Settlers cut down trees only in the center of the valley to build houses. The edge of the forest always remained untouched to preserve the protective barrier. Rocky outcrops became natural walls for many buildings. Houses pressed their blank facades against the cold stones. The stone absorbed the brunt of the icy squalls. Over many years, the surface of the rocks was polished by constant winds. Inside the houses behind such rocks, precious warmth was preserved. Settlements by the sea required a special approach to planning. Coastal villages hid behind high sand dunes. The dunes took the brunt of the salty sea winds. People reinforced these sandy hills with the roots of tough grasses. This natural shield prevented the cold from penetrating the streets of the village. Each building in the village was located with regard to neighboring buildings. Houses were placed so that they protected each other. The central square was always in aerodynamic shadow. Streets were made narrow and winding to prevent drafts. Straight passages between houses would instantly turn into wind tunnels. Additional earthen embankments were built near the entrances to the houses. These low hills forced the wind to bend around the doorways. The entrance area always remained the most vulnerable part of the building. The earthen embankment broke the airflow into two safe parts. People calmly entered their homes without the risk of letting in the cold. Even the shape of the coastline played an important role. Bays with narrow necks did not allow storms to enter. Settlers chose bays closed off by islands from the open sea. The islands dampened the waves and reduced the speed of the cold air. The water in such bays froze more slowly due to the absence of strong winds. Villages were often located on the southern slopes of hills. The south side received more of the scarce winter sun. The sun's rays slightly warmed the wood of the longhouses. The northern slope of the hill completely blocked the icy Arctic masses. The cold air simply rolled over the top of the hill and moved on. The ability to read the landscape was passed down from generation to generation. Mistakes in choosing a location were too costly in the harsh climate. The correct location of a settlement reduced heat loss by half. Builders used nature as their main ally. I would be very interested to hear your opinion on this approach taken by ancient builders. Please write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about the hidden defensive lines of northern settlements? The trees around the village were not just a source of wood for hearths. The dense coniferous forests acted as a huge natural filter for squalls. The branches of spruce and pine trees broke up the single stream of air into thousands of small eddies. After passing through the forest belt, the Arctic wind lost its destructive power. The settlers deliberately preserved the forests on the north side. Tree felling was strictly controlled by the community elders. The denudation of the northern slopes would have had catastrophic consequences for the houses. Tree trunks were covered with a thick layer of snow and ice in the middle of winter. This icy shell made the forest barrier completely impenetrable to the wind. The shrubs on the outskirts of the village also served a protective function. The dense thickets trapped the snow flurries rushing across the ground. Without the shrubs, the snow would have blown directly onto the walls of the longhouses. The thickets created a first zone of calm air in front of the facades of the buildings. People deliberately planted dense vegetation in the most windy areas. Water barriers were also used to control the temperature. Wide rivers in front of the settlement smoothed out temperature differences. The ice on the river formed a smooth surface without obstacles. Therefore, houses were never built right at the water's edge. A strip of land with boulders was always left between the shore and the village. Large boulders worked as excellent windbreakers. Huge stones left by the glacier were not removed from the fields on purpose. Behind each such stone, an aerodynamic shadow zone was formed. The wind hit the granite boulder and lost its speed. Gradually, these stones became covered with moss and became part of the protective system. Artificial natural barriers complemented the existing landscape. Builders piled up hills of rubble in the path of prevailing winds. Layers of dense clay and earth were laid on top of the rubble. Over time, these hills became overgrown with grass and blended in with the terrain. They acted as springboards, throwing the airflow over the roofs of houses. The peat bogs near the village were also beneficial. The frozen peat prevented the deep cold from reaching the foundations. The flat surface of the bog allowed the wind to glide further without swirling. Villages were often located on hills just beyond the peat bogs. This position ensured dryness and protection from low-lying blizzards. Ravines and deep crevices served as channels for cold air to escape. Heavy, frosty air rolled down into these natural depressions. People built their homes above the level of these cold drains. The bottom of the ravine experienced the lowest temperatures in winter. The tops of the hills remained warmer and more comfortable for living. The coastal cliffs formed a powerful aerodynamic shield. Sea storms crashed against the stone wall and receded upward. The settlement located behind the cliff was in a zone of relative calm. Ocean spray froze directly on the rocks, increasing their height. This icy barrier stood until spring, protecting the peace of the people. The landscape became a veritable fortress without stone walls. The natural elements worked in harmony to protect the wooden structures. Every tree, rock, and hill performed its engineering task. Humans simply integrated their houses into this existing system. But if nature failed, how exactly did the ideal aerodynamic shape of the building itself save the community from certain death in a blizzard? Guess how long it took to create this aerodynamic perfection? Longhouses of the Viking era always had the shape of an elongated rectangle with rounded corners. This geometry allowed air currents to flow smoothly around the walls of the building. Sharp corners would have created strong turbulence and cooled the wood. The smooth lines of the facade worked like the hull of a ship cutting through waves. The main rule was to position the house along the prevailing wind line. The short end walls took the brunt of the elements. The area of the end wall was minimal compared to the long side facades. The wind simply slid along the long walls without exerting much pressure on them. A transverse arrangement would inevitably have led to the destruction of the building. The end walls were often made solid, without a single opening. This is where the most powerful snowdrifts accumulated during winter storms. Massive oak boards in this part of the house were fitted together with particular precision. The absence of gaps at the ends ensured that heat was retained inside the dwelling. The snow that stuck to these walls served as an additional layer of insulation. Doors were always located on the south or leeward side. This prevented snow from blowing directly into the living space when the door was open. Doorways were made very low to minimize heat loss. People entering had to bend down low to get inside. The small area of the doorway kept the hot air that accumulated under the roof inside. The rounded ends of the house resembled an upside-down boat. Master shipbuilders applied their skills to the construction of land buildings. The smoothly curved walls prevented the wind from catching on the surface. The airflow was smoothly divided in two and flowed away to the sides. The aerodynamics of these buildings were centuries ahead of their time. The entrance doors were equipped with a complex system of internal vestibules. Before entering the main hall, a person had to pass through a narrow corridor. This corridor served as a buffer zone between the Arctic cold and the warmth of the home. The air in the vestibule always remained cold, blocking the escape of warm air. This airlock system reliably sealed the microclimate inside the longhouse. The long facades were slightly tilted inward. This tilt helped redistribute the weight of the heavy roof onto the foundation. The sloping walls better withstood side winds during storms. The wind simply pressed the boards more tightly against the frame, strengthening the structure. Builders used the force of nature to give the building additional strength. The siding boards were laid overlapping, like fish scales. The top board always overlapped the bottom board by a few centimeters. Water and snow easily rolled off such a surface without getting into the gaps. Moisture did not linger on the walls and did not destroy the wood when it froze. The icy wind only pressed the boards closer together. The gaps between the oak logs were carefully caulked with moss and clay. Moss had the ability to expand when absorbing moisture from the air. Dried clay turned into a stone shell that protected the soft moss. The walls became completely monolithic and impervious to drafts. This painstaking work was repeated every fall before the onset of cold weather. The ideal location of the house allowed it to survive the longest winters. The building stood for decades, withstanding the onslaught of the icy ocean. The skill of the builders transformed simple wood into reliable armor. Architecture served as the main protection against the merciless nature of the North. Like this video if you are also impressed by the ingenuity of the ancient craftsmen. Want to know a secret that will change your life and your view of architecture? The roofs of northern longhouses were covered with a heavy layer of living turf. This green roof weighed dozens of tons and required an incredibly strong frame. Massive internal pillars bore the enormous weight of the earth. Such weight was necessary to prevent the roof from being blown off by hurricane-force winds. The process of creating a turf roof was a complex engineering task. A continuous decking of thin poles was laid on wooden rafters. Several layers of birch bark were laid on top of the poles for waterproofing. The bark was laid with a large overlap to prevent meltwater from getting inside. The bark did not rot for decades, reliably protecting the wooden frame of the building. Only after the bark was laid did it become time for the earthen blocks. Turf was cut into thick squares from the nearest meadows and carried to the house. The first layer was laid with the grass facing down, directly on the birch bark. The roots of the grass clung tightly together, forming a dense natural carpet. This layer served as the main protection against the interior freezing. The second layer of turf was laid with the grass facing up, creating a living surface. The grass continued to grow on the roof, strengthening the earth with its roots. The vegetation absorbed excess moisture during the long autumn rains. The half-meter thick earthen cap had phenomenal thermal insulation properties. The heat from the hearth could not break through this barrier to the outside. The enormous weight of the turf played a key role in wind resistance. During storms, the roof literally pressed the entire house to the ground. The wind could not lift such a mass, even if it penetrated under the eaves. Wet from rain or snow, the turf became even heavier and more reliable. The structure stood like a monolith, like a rock growing out of the ground. The angle of the roof was calculated with mathematical precision. Too steep a slope would cause heavy soil to slide off during rains. Too flat a roof would accumulate a critical amount of snow in winter. The ideal angle allowed the snow to lie in an even layer, providing additional insulation. When it warmed up, excess moisture flowed quietly down the edges of the birch bark flooring. The edges of the roof were reinforced with massive logs with carved grooves. These logs kept the turf from sliding and served as gutters. Water was drained away from the foundation, keeping the wood dry. Deep eaves protected the side walls from slanting rain and snow. Firewood for the winter was often stored under these eaves. The earthen roof did not burn, which was a huge advantage. Sparks from the central hearth often fell on the roof surface. The turf instantly extinguished these sparks, preventing large-scale fires in the village. In strong winds, a fire could destroy the entire settlement in minutes. The earth became a reliable shield against two main enemies, cold and fire. In winter, the grass on the roof froze, and the earth turned to stone. The snow cover blended in with the white landscape, camouflaging the houses. The layer of snow on top of the turf created a thermos effect inside the dwelling. The temperature difference between inside and outside could reach 40 degrees. The wood under the bark always remained dry and retained its strength. Building such a roof required the efforts of the entire community. People worked for weeks to provide reliable shelter before the first frost. The turf roof was a symbol of man's unity with the harsh nature. It literally turned the house into part of the landscape. In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with this terrible weather inside the house itself. The interior of the longhouse was designed as a single heating mechanism. The building had no solid partitions to obstruct the movement of warm air. The huge hall was divided into zones only by rows of supporting columns. The absence of interior walls allowed the heat from the hearth to fill the room evenly. Air circulated freely, warming every corner of the massive structure. The main hall was located in the very center of the long building. It was here that a long rectangular hearth, lined with stones, burned constantly. The fire never went out, maintained by members of the community on duty day and night. The central location of the heat source was the only way to heat such a large space. The cold coming in from the end walls was neutralized before it reached the people. Wide wooden platforms were located along the side walls. These platforms served as both workbenches and beds for sleeping. The platforms rose to a considerable height above the earthen floor. Raising the sleeping areas saved people from the cold drafts coming from below. Firewood and provisions were stored under the platforms, creating an additional air cushion. The warmest places by the fire were reserved for the elders and the chief. Closer to the edges of the hall, where it was cooler, were the work areas. In these areas, people wove, repaired nets, and carved tools from wood. The distribution of places depended on the need for warmth and light. The life of the entire community revolved around this elongated source of fire. Smoke from the hearth rose to the high ceiling of the longhouse. A thick layer of hot air and smoke accumulated under the roof. This layer acted as a thermal blanket, keeping out the cold from above. The smoke gradually escaped through special openings in the roof ridge. Soot settled on the wooden beams, protecting them from rot and woodworms. During severe frosts, the interior space was narrowed with the help of animal skins. People stretched thick cloths between the supporting pillars around the central hearth. An inner tent was formed from thick fabric and animal skins. This allowed heat to be concentrated in a minimal area, saving firewood. The rest of the hall temporarily became a cold buffer zone. The earthen floor in the house was carefully compacted over many years. In some houses, the floor was dug below the level of the ground outside. Lowering the foundation helped to use the geothermal heat of the planet itself. The ground around the house froze, but the temperature under the floor remained above freezing. This simple technique significantly reduced the amount of wood needed for heating. The walls were often covered with thick woven carpets on the inside. Woolen fabrics blocked microscopic drafts coming through the cracks in the logs. The bright patterns on the tapestries also decorated the dark interior. The air between the logs and the fabric served as an additional insulating layer. This textile armor preserved precious degrees during days-long blizzards. Storage rooms for supplies were located at the cold ends of the building. Keeping food cool ensured its preservation throughout the winter. Frozen meat and fish were stored near the solid end walls. These storage rooms took the brunt of the Arctic cold. The food froze solid, protecting the main living area. The builder's engineering mindset was evident in every detail of the interior. The space was divided into temperature zones without the use of solid walls. People learned to control the airflows inside the huge room. A rational approach to planning ensured the survival of dozens of people under one roof. The architecture of the interior zones was as well thought out as the exterior form. What if everything you've been taught is outdated and the real shield was built out of snow? In winter, ordinary snow became the main building material for protection from the wind. After the first heavy snowfalls, the community set out to build temporary snow walls. These barriers were built a short distance from the wooden facades of the houses. Snow, which usually brings cold weather, became a reliable heat insulator here. Snow blocks were cut with shovels directly from the dense snowdrifts around the village. These blocks were used to build high walls that followed the contours of the settlement. The thickness of such a snow shield could reach several meters at the base. Air bubbles trapped in the snow made it an ideal heat insulator. The snow wall completely dampened the wind speed, preventing it from hitting the wooden logs. The space between the house and the snow wall served as an air buffer. In this narrow corridor, the temperature was always higher than in the open. People could move around the house without being exposed to the icy squalls. The snow reliably protected the doorways from direct hurricane gusts. The entrance to the house turned into a deep tunnel dug into the white mass. The snow walls were often sprayed with water to create an icy crust. In severe frost, the water froze instantly, turning the wall into a monolith. The icy shell did not break even under the strongest winds. Such fortifications could stand until spring without needing repair. The ice reflected the gusts of wind, sending cold air high into the sky. Snowdrifts were also used to directly insulate wooden walls. People deliberately threw snow onto the lower part of the facade with shovels. The snowbank covered the most vulnerable places where the logs joined the foundation. This additional insulation prevented the floor inside the dwelling from freezing. The snow tightly covered the unevenness of the wood, sealing any cracks. The architecture of the snow barriers was carefully planned by the elders. Special passages were left for ventilation and smoke to escape from the hearths. If the house was completely covered with snow, the draft in the hearth could disappear. Air had to circulate properly above the roof to remove carbon monoxide. The snow engineers of the era knew exactly how to direct the wind currents. In the spring, these ice fortresses began to slowly melt under the rays of the sun. Meltwater was carefully drained from the wooden walls through pre-dug ditches. This process provided the ground around the house with the necessary moisture before sowing. The temporary barriers disappeared, having fulfilled their vital function. Nature itself removed the building material until the following winter. Building these shelters was hard physical labor for everyone, but this work ensured the community's survival during the harshest months. Snow was not seen as an enemy, but as an accessible and reliable tool. The ability to use the environment was the key to the prosperity of the northern peoples. Each snowfall brought not only cold, but also new building material. The massive snowdrifts on the roofs were also left untouched. They merged with the snow walls, turning the house into a white hill. Visually, the village could completely disappear into the winter landscape. Only the smoke rising from the holes in the snow revealed the presence of people. It was the perfect camouflage and impeccable thermal insulation at the same time. This innovative approach to using snow saved scarce firewood supplies. Winter barriers took the brunt of the elements, protecting the main dwelling. Snow became an integral part of the seasonal architecture of northern settlements. Survival depended on the ability to harness this unstable material. In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with this terrible weather with the help of giant earthen embankments. Substantial defensive structures began with large-scale earthworks around the settlement. Longhouses were often surrounded by high artificial embankments of compacted soil. These embankments were designed not so much to protect against enemies as against the weather. The earthen rampart served as the first massive obstacle in the path of the icy air. It changed the trajectory of the ground-level wind currents. The construction of the rampart required the movement of thousands of cubic meters of heavy soil and stones. The moat from which the earth was taken became an additional barrier in front of the rampart. The frosty air, heavy and dense, rolled down to the bottom of this deep moat. Once in the depression, the wind flow lost its initial kinetic energy. The embankment rising behind the ditch finally redirected the remaining wind upward. The earthen rampart always had a gentle outer slope and a steep inner slope. The gentle slope allowed the wind to rise smoothly without creating destructive eddies. The flow glided over the grass and rose high above the roofs of the longhouses. The steep inner slope created a zone of complete aerodynamic calm within the perimeter. It was in this calm zone that the community's residential buildings were located. Intertwined tree roots were actively used to reinforce the earthen embankments. Strong oak stakes were driven into the ground and intertwined with flexible willow rods. This internal reinforcement prevented the earth from crumbling under the influence of rain. The rampart was sown with tough grasses with deep root systems. The roots penetrated the soil, turning the hill into a monolithic structure. A dense row of thorny shrubs was often planted on top of the embankment. This living fence served as an additional air mass diffuser. Even the strongest and sharpest squalls could not break through the dense branches. The shrubs trapped flying snow, forming a massive snowdrift on top of the rampart. This snowdrift increased the height of the protective structure in the middle of winter. The entrances to the settlement through the earthen rampart were made in the form of winding corridors. Straight gates would have become a pipe drawing cold air into the village. The corridors were located at an angle to each other, forming a system of turns. The wind broke against the walls of these bends, completely losing its force. People could easily pass through the labyrinth, while squalls got stuck in dead ends. The earthen fortifications required constant maintenance and repair every spring. The settling soil had to be replenished, and the destroyed sections had to be restored. The community set aside special days for mass work on the earthen ramparts. This structure was a guarantee that the coming winters would be warm. The reliability of the rampart directly affected the amount of wood burned in the stoves. The inner perimeter of the rampart was often used for the construction of utility buildings. Pens and small tool sheds were attached to the earthen wall. The earth transferred its constant positive temperature to the buildings during severe frosts. The rear wall of such outbuildings was completely protected from external temperature fluctuations. The rational use of every square meter was a law of survival. Double earthen ramparts were erected around the largest and richest settlements. The space between the two rings of embankments served as an additional buffer zone. The wind that overcame the first barrier was finally stuck before the second ring of defense. This system created an ideal microclimate in the very center of the protected area. Only communities with good labor organization could build such a system. Landscape engineering became the answer to the challenges of the Arctic climate. People changed the shape of the land to alter the direction of invisible winds. Massive earthen ramparts stood for centuries, protecting generations of northern builders. Nature and architecture merged in these large-scale defensive lines. Earth became the most reliable and durable building material of the era. The most important factor in heat retention was the complete rejection of traditional windows. The walls of longhouses in the Viking era had no openings for lighting. Glass windows were unknown, and any other materials let in the cold. Even an opening tightly covered with a bull's bladder would have been a source of deadly drafts. Builders deliberately sacrificed daylight in order to preserve precious degrees of heat. Solid wooden walls were an absolute barrier to the Arctic winds. The absence of openings would have disrupted the monolithic nature of the oak or pine paneling. Each window would inevitably weaken the structure under strong lateral pressure from squalls. A windowless building had maximum strength and resistance to deformation. The darkness inside the room was a fair price to pay for survival in the harsh winter. The only source of natural light was small smoke vents. They were located at the very top of the roof, along the ridge line. Light penetrated through these narrow slits along with fresh, frosty air. The openings were so small that the light barely dispelled the darkness under the arches. The main lighting was provided by the fire in the central hearth and small oil lamps. The design of the smoke vents had a complex airflow control system. The openings were equipped with movable wooden flaps on long poles. Depending on the direction of the wind, only the dampers on the leeward side were opened. The wind curving around the roof created an area of low pressure above the open vent. This drew the smoke out, preventing the cold from entering the room. If a strong blizzard began outside, the flaps were closed almost completely. Only a tiny gap remained for the carbon monoxide from the smoldering coals to escape. At such moments, it became as dark inside the longhouse as in a deep cave. People relied on touch and memory, moving along familiar routes in the hall. Keeping warm was always prioritized over visual comfort. The absence of windows dictated a special rhythm of life for the entire northern community. In winter, activity was reduced to a minimum and concentrated around the bright fire. Delicate handiwork was done only in close proximity to the blazing hearth. Craftsmen carved wood and wove clothes in a circle of soft yellow light. The dark corners of the house were used exclusively for sleeping and storing supplies. In summer, the doors of the longhouse were left open for ventilation and light. The long daylight hours allowed for many tasks to be performed outside in the sun. The interior was cleared of the soot and dampness that had accumulated over the winter. The dark walls were dried by the fresh, warm wind blowing from the south. But with the onset of the first autumn storms, the building was sealed shut again. Fat lamps helped to combat the darkness of the long winter nights. Small stone bowls were filled with fish fat or seal blubber. A wick made of dry moss gave off a dim but steady light without much smoke. These lamps were placed around the perimeter of the hall on special wooden shelves. The light was dim, but it was enough to maintain basic activity. The darkness inside the dwelling shaped the northerners' unique perception of the world. Stories, myths, and legends were told by the crackling of logs in the semi-darkness. Shadows on the dark walls came to life, creating a unique, epic atmosphere. The windowless architecture directly influenced the culture and folklore of an entire people. The house was not just a shelter, it was a closed universe for its inhabitants. The absence of windows demonstrated the builders' deep understanding of the physics of heat exchange. Solid wooden walls were the ultimate solution in the fight against the icy climate. The radical simplicity of the design ensured unmatched efficiency in heating the large hall. The house became a safe, reliably storing the most valuable treasure of the North, warmth. The engineering was focused on insulation rather than interaction with the external environment. The construction of a longhouse began with the laying of a massive stone foundation. Stone played a crucial role in protecting the wooden frame from the frozen ground. Direct contact between the wood and the ground would have led to rapid rotting of the logs. Moisture from the soil would have instantly destroyed the lower crowns of the building. Builders laid a continuous line of huge boulders around the entire perimeter of the building. The process of preparing the foundation required excavating the soil to a considerable depth. The trenches were filled with crushed stone to ensure good drainage of meltwater. Flat stones were laid on top of the crushed stone, creating a level platform for the oak beams. This stone cushion insulated the wood from the destructive effects of groundwater. Even during heavy spring floods, the foundation of the house remained completely dry. The stone foundation also solved the problem of frost heaving in northern soils. In winter, the ground froze and expanded, pushing any light structures upward. Heavy boulders held the ground firmly in place, preventing it from deforming the wooden frame. The weight of the building itself was evenly distributed across the stones via oak posts. The structure retained its geometry regardless of seasonal fluctuations in soil level. The space between the foundation stones was carefully filled with a mixture of clay and sand. This sealant prevented icy drafts from penetrating under the floors of the living quarters. The gaps between the boulders were the most dangerous place for heat to escape. A dense clay plug turned the foundation into a monolithic, impermeable barrier. The wind broke against the stones, unable to find a way inside the longhouse. The height of the stone base often reached half a meter above ground level. This raised the wooden walls above the level of the maximum snowdrifts. The snow only came into contact with stone, which was not subject to decay. Melting water in the spring rolled down the stones without touching the precious oak boards. The base served as the first line of defense for wooden facades against aggressive moisture. In some regions, the foundation was made double for additional thermal insulation. A layer of dry peat or sheep's wool was poured between two rows of stones. This air gap acted as an ideal thermal break between the street and the house. The cold from the outer stones was not transferred to the inner perimeter of the building. The earthen floor inside the hall remained protected from freezing on the sides. Particular attention was paid to the corners of the building, where the load was greatest. The largest and heaviest boulders of regular shape were laid in the corners. These anchor stones held the entire structure in place during hurricane-force winds. The force of the wind tried to move the house from its place, but the stones held the frame firmly in place. The massiveness of the foundation was the key to the stability of the light wooden superstructure. The stones for the foundation were collected by the entire settlement over a long period of time. Flat granite slabs, shaped by ancient glaciers, were ideal for this purpose. Transporting such heavy weights required the use of levers and wooden rollers. This monumental work laid the foundation for the building for many generations to come. The house could burn down, but the stone foundation remained ready for a new structure. Inside the house, stones were used to line the central rectangular hearth. The fire heated these stones during the day, and they gave off heat during the cold night. The stone hearth served as a huge heating battery in the center of the long hall. The more stones there were around the fire, the more stable the air temperature was. The heat capacity of the stone compensated for temperature fluctuations when the open flame died down. The use of stone demonstrated a pragmatic approach to the choice of building materials. Wood provided flexibility and warmth, while stone provided insulation and strength. The combination of these elements created architecture capable of surviving the Arctic winter. The stone foundation was an inconspicuous but essential element of the protective system. The houses stood firmly, resting on cold but reliable bedrock. The heating system of a longhouse was built around the strategic placement of hearths. The central fire was not the only source of heat in large settlements. In elongated buildings, several independent fireplaces were installed along the central axis. These fire points created a uniform temperature front along the entire length of the room. The heat was distributed without cold spots between the sleeping platforms. The length of the main hearth could reach several meters, resembling a burning river. This solution allowed to heat the maximum number of people sitting on both sides. The long line of fire created a powerful upward flow of hot air. This flow formed a reliable thermal curtain right in the center of the building. The draft was so strong that the smoke rose strictly vertically into the roof. Small auxiliary hearths were sometimes installed at the end walls. They served as thermal buffers, blocking the cold coming through the entrance doors. These small fires took the brunt of the icy drafts from the vestibule. The cold air was heated instantly, before it had time to penetrate the main living area. The system of several fireplaces worked as a staggered line of defense against the cold. Firewood was prepared in advance and dried in a special way. Hardwoods were used, which produced a lot of heat and little smoke. Ash and oak provided long, even burning at high temperatures. Wet wood was strictly prohibited as it emitted acrid carbon monoxide. A supply of dry logs was kept right in the hall to maintain continuous burning. At night, the open flame was smothered by covering it with a thick layer of ash. The coals continued to smolder under the ashes, maintaining a high temperature until morning. The heat output was smooth and stable for many hours. In the morning, the person on duty simply fanned the coals and added fresh wood for a bright flame. This method saved resources and prevented nighttime fires in wooden houses. Controlling the fire was a crucial responsibility of experienced community members. Overheating the room led to the drying out of wooden beams and the risk of ignition. A lack of heat meant illness for the weakest members of the village. Balancing the temperature required constant attention to the direction of the wind and the severity of the frost. Managing the hearth was a true art of survival in harsh conditions. The area around the hearth was paved with flat stones for safety. This paved area protected the earthen floor from drying out and cracking. Wet woolen clothes and leather shoes were dried on the hot stones after a storm. Drying equipment was critical to preventing frostbite outdoors. The hearth served as the main drying room for dozens of people at a time. The smoke, slowly rising to the roof ridge, sterilized the air in the room. Phenolic compounds in wood smoke killed bacteria and prevented epidemics. The dense concentration of people in one room required constant air disinfection. Smoke coped with this task, acting as a natural antiseptic. Conditions were harsh, but sanitary safety was maintained at an acceptable level. The thermal architecture of the building was based on the proper removal of carbon monoxide. High ceilings allowed hazardous substances to accumulate far above the heads of seated people. The smoke vents were precisely calibrated to the volume of fuel burned. An error in calculation could lead to the suffocation of the entire community during sleep. Precise engineering ensured the safe use of open fire in a closed wooden structure. Fire was the heart of the longhouse, a pulsating source of life and energy. The entire logic of the layout of the walls, roof, and doors was built around it. Every architectural element served a single purpose: to keep that heat inside. The house was simply a shell designed to preserve this burning heart. Victory over the cold was achieved through the harmony of fire and wooden engineering. We have seen how Scandinavian craftsmen turned their settlements into impregnable bastions. Every detail of their architecture was dictated by the harsh laws of survival in the north. Longhouses were an ingenious symbiosis of aerodynamics, geometry, and thermophysics. These structures prove that humans are capable of adapting to the most extreme conditions on the planet. Knowledge and experience replaced complex technologies, creating reliable protection from the deadly cold. The history of northern settlements is a story of the victory of human intellect over blind nature. The architectural solutions of that era still amaze us with their thoughtfulness and pragmatism. These ancient builders left us a lesson of the utmost respect for the forces of nature. Their methods of combating Arctic winds can inspire even modern engineers. What do you think of today's topic on the engineering of northern settlements? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel.